We start in Venezuela, where President Nicolas Maduro is currently addressing the Bolivarian armed forces. Let's listen in.
Soberano, constitucional, para la búsqueda de una agenda nacional
in order to reach peace and understanding. This is why I say and ratify.
Señores oficiales,
officers.
Señoras oficiales. Por eso digo y ratifico, soldados.
This is why I say soldiers,
milicianos y milicianas.
militiamen and women. This is why I repeat.
A Dios rogando con el diálogo, el entendimiento, la diplomacia.
We're asking God for dialogue, diplomacy, high diplomacy, peace.
A Dios rogando y con el mazo dando, con los fusiles aceitados para defender la soberanía territorial donde nos
readying
cuando nos toque
our weapons to defend our homeland. To be prepared.
Muchachos y muchachas.
Men and women.
Bajo este sol,
under the sun,
bajo este cielo iluminado,
under this illuminated sky,
resplandor permanente del Zulia,
in Zulia, I ratify my thanks
por su disciplina, su
for your discipline and your obedience, your loyalty, your loyalty.
Ha surgido una consigna.
There's a new slogan from the heart, from the guts of the military units.
Y esa consigna corre hoy.
And that slogan runs through the people of Venezuela.
Y esa consigna lo dice todo.
And that slogan says everything. In front of the desperate imperialists. Today, once again, John Bolton is calling upon the Venezuelan military to carry out a coup, to ignore the Constitution, and to serve the White House and Donald Trump. I say to you, where's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces in Venezuela? In the White House? Who is the head of the armed forces? Donald Trump? Where's the morale? Where's the morale of the armed forces, of the Bolivarian armed forces in Washington? Is John Bolton the head of the armed forces in Venezuela? So to John Bolton, we tell them the doctrine of the Bolivarian armed forces. This is the response from the armed forces to your coup attempt. Loyals forever. So that people can hear in Washington, loyalty forever. Chavez is alive.
Independencia y patria socialista.
Socialist homeland, loyal forever.
Muchas gracias, muchachos. Para adelante, con mucho amor.
Thank you kindly, guys.
La victoria nos pertenece.
Victory is ours.
La victoria es nuestra. Muchas gracias, muchachos.
Thank you kindly.
Para la bomba, proceder. La bomba.
Bolivariana de Venezuela, Nicolás.
La bomba, bomba. Bomba.
Bolivariana Nicolás Maduro Moro, quien pues participa en la supervisión de estas.
That was Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro speaking to the armed forces. Now we go to other news. Former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has been handed a new sentence of nearly 13 years by a Brazilian court. This is the second sentence for Lula in connection with corruption allegations. This time, a Brazilian court ruled that Lula illegally benefited from renovations on a property made by construction companies Odebrecht and Shaheen. The property wasn't owned by him. Lula has already spent over 300 days behind bars due to a similar sentence. And in a social media message, the president of the Workers' Party, Gleisi Hoffmann, condemned Lula's new sentence. Hoffmann says Lula is greater than his executioners and that his incarceration makes him a better candidate for a Nobel Peace Prize. The former presidential candidate of the Socialism and Liberty Party in Brazil, Guilherme Boulos, has also expressed his solidarity with Lula. Via Twitter, Boulos rejected the bias of Brazilian justice, saying the judiciary is against Lula. He has also called the former president a political prisoner. Our correspondent in Brazil, Brian Meir, has more details.
On February 6th in Curitiba, interim judge Gabriela Hart sentenced former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva to 12 years in prison on corruption charges involving alleged illegal reforms on a vacation property in the neighboring state of São Paulo. This is the second case levied against the former president as part of Operation Lava Jato, which is a joint collaborative effort between a local court system in Curitiba associated with Jair Bolsonaro's current Justice Minister, Sergio Moro, and the United States Department of Justice. And just as in the first case, which resulted in Lula being behind bars, the investigator, Sergio Moro, was unable to prove that the former president actually owned the property in question. In this case, the property is owned by a man named Fernando Bittar. Fernando Bittar is the son of one of Lula's best friends, Juca Bittar, another former union leader and former mayor of Campinas, which is one of the largest and wealthiest cities in Brazil. And the two families have been spending vacations, Christmas, and holidays together for 30 years. However, they were unable to prove that he owned the property. Another thing that legal scholars are pointing out about this case is that when the alleged reforms are said to have taken place, Lula was no longer in public office. He was no longer president. So how could there have been a quid pro quo if he wasn't a public official? And another thing that legal scholars are pointing out who criticize the political nature of Lula's prosecution in this case is that the property in question isn't within the jurisdiction of the local courts in Curitiba. It's in a neighboring state that has its own court system, São Paulo. So this is why hundreds of legal scholars, both nationally and internationally, including Queen's Counsel Jeffrey Robertson, have been calling these criminal charges against the former president as lawfare. Lawfare is the use of legal tools for political prosecution, and the fact that the man who created this investigation in the first place, Sergio Moro, is now a cabinet minister for President Jair Bolsonaro, indicates that there's some kind of political motives behind this prosecution of the former.
That was Brian Meir from Sao Paulo. And we stay in Brazil. The death toll from the January 25 dam collapse has risen to 150. The dam collapse in Brumadinho in Minas Gerais unleashed a mudslide that destroyed many buildings and homes in the region. Nearly 200 people are still missing. Many of them were residents of the destroyed neighborhoods and employees of Vale, the mining company. And health problems in the area may be on the rise following the ecological disaster. Cases of dengue fever, yellow fever, infectious diseases, and even suicides are expected in the long run. According to researchers, Brumadinho has become an endemic area for a number of diseases.
We need to learn from what happened and think about strategies that combine public and private efforts. It is unacceptable the public health sector to bear the full burden of such a tragedy, and that the company that is responsible for it collects all the profits from the exploitation.
Now to Uruguay, where President Tabaré Vázquez has met with the Mexican foreign minister in Uruguay. The gathering happened a day before Vázquez hosts an international meeting to discuss the situation in Venezuela. Marcelo Ebrard also tweeted a photo of the leaders of CARICOM member nations who agreed to participate in the meeting. And the UN Secretary General expressed his support to the upcoming meeting in Uruguay. Antonio Guterres has insisted that dialogue is the only way to find a solution to the political situation in Venezuela. The session, hosted by the European Union and the Uruguayan government, will be held on Thursday in Montevideo. 13 EU and Latin American countries will participate. On Tuesday, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro launched the country's transport mission at the Caracas metro system. The program has the goal of better connecting the country on a national level. He also announced the creation of an experimental university of transport to boost land, sea, and air transport. He also said a new public transport system will be created using Venezuelan research and innovation. Political groups, social movements, and trade unions marched outside the U.S. Embassy in Argentina. They rejected the coup d'etat in Venezuela orchestrated by the U.S.
Despite the repression from the government of Mauricio Macri, which is trying to hide the Argentine people's support for the constitutional president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and the Bolivarian revolution, hundreds of protesters demanded the end of aggression against the land of Chavez and Bolivar.
We're marching for Venezuela's sovereignty and for Nicolas Maduro. We think that you have to respect the mandate of the recently elected president. What is happening in Venezuela is ridiculous. And if there's a situation there, it's because it was provoked by the United States and Venezuelan economic groups that make the people go hungry. It's a lie that the people who are suffering are those that have left. Those who are suffering are those who stayed, saying to the U.S. that there's no place for their plans in the region.
According to the activists, the thousands of coups organized across all the continents of the world by the United States, the invasions, the bombing of civilians, and the support for the worst authoritarian regimes mean that Washington has no right to talk about dictatorships and human rights in Venezuela.
We are seeing how they're trying to articulate a position in the European Union, how the Cartel Lima countries are trying to formulate opinion in each of our countries. So we have to take to the streets, not just in Latin America, but all over the world. We have to show that the Venezuelan people aren't alone, and that the real enemy in common is United States imperialism.
The leaders of distinct political groups, social movements, and trade unions called for the march to demand dialogue as proposed by Uruguay, Mexico, and the Vatican, as well as to avoid the tragedy caused by the North American intervention.
We support the meeting called by Mexico and Uruguay, which is going to take place in Montevideo February 7th. We are going to actively participate in this process because Latin American peace depends on how things go following this provocation, and whether we can stop North American aggression against Venezuelan people and President Nicolas Maduro.
Mauricio Macri's political interference was anonymously rejected. In the whole history of the Argentine Republic, no president has ever intervened in internal affairs of another country, including during the dictatorships.
We've aided, in each government, peaceful solutions to conflicts. We can't throw NAFTA to the fire like Donald Trump or like Bolsonaro, both of whom are psychopaths. We demand that our president Mauricio Macri reverses his totally incorrect decision. We ask the same of the international community. There was an interesting poll today which revealed that the Argentine people want a solution through dialogue.
The protester unraveled the lie that the Argentine people support self-proclaimed President Juan Guaido and rejected his action as illegitimate, illegal and violent. They say they will continue to act to ensure that Latin America remains at peace.
We have more stories coming up. We'll be back. Welcome back. On Wednesday, U.S. President Donald Trump delivered his second State of the Union address. The economy, border security, and foreign policy were at the top of his agenda. He said that he will build the wall on the Mexican border in the name of national security and said that the U.S. will never be a socialist country. After the speech, we spoke with researcher Vijay Prashad about the possibility of a U.S. military intervention in Venezuela.
No, I think that we have to be very, very careful about what the United States does in the short term regarding Venezuela. The United States government has, attempted using the techniques of what we consider hybrid war. It has used all these techniques to conduct a regime change operation inside Venezuela. There are attempts to bribe section of the Venezuelan military to turn against the government. This is a playbook, a set of operating principles that the United States has used since 1953 in Iran and 1954 in Guatemala. These are not new techniques, but they're at play again against Venezuela. You know, there is a serious situation. A country like Venezuela, its external revenues so deeply tied to oil prices, and with oil prices at 50% down, you know, certainly there are economic complications for Venezuela. The United States has used this economic complexity to push for regime change. It's a very dangerous period.
We were also joined by journalist and host of the Empire Files, Abby Martin. Among other topics, she deconstructed some of Trump's rhetoric over the past 2 years.
This is a man who lies through his teeth. You can't even count the amount of lies that he says. I mean, he talks about his inauguration, audience being the biggest in history. He talks about how there's prayer shawls being found in the desert. I mean, he epitomizes fake news, but somehow because of the failures of the corporate media, he's been able to legitimize that he somehow is the purveyor of truth to his unquestioning base.
And Martin also highlighted the hypocrisy of the U.S. Democratic Party and their complicity in the building of a border wall with Mexico.
Look, there is a wall that extends nearly the entire span of the southwestern U.S. border. Where there isn't a wall, there's treacherous mountainous terrain. And there's a wall where people already don't think that there's a wall. The Democrats are going along with this policy because we know Bill Clinton in 1996 put that death by deterrence. They wanted to funnel migrants into the most death-defying routes so that they could die and use their deaths as somehow a deterrent to the rest of the people in Mexico and Latin America. This obviously doesn't work. There's thousands of migrants dying every year in the desert. The Democrats are pretending bizarrely that there is not a wall because they want to play this faux humanitarian angle opposition to Trump. Both think that people should be deported en masse. Obama was the deporter in chief. Here you have Trump basically lying again. He's claiming kids in cages are crisis actors. Their parents are using children as pawns, that the Mexican government is putting gangs and drug dealers on these migrant caravans. I mean, it is disgraceful, this kind of rhetoric. Remember, we cannot normalize this behavior. We cannot normalize a fascist sitting in office encouraging to shoot migrant children at the border. This rhetoric has impact, and he has the audacity to use the synagogue shooting as a way to fight anti-Semitism in this country. What he doesn't mention is that mass murder was a direct correlation to his rhetoric against the migrant caravan. So how far is this going to go? I mean, this whole proposition that he made was basically an announcement that he is going to drastically escalate this fascist war on immigrants far past than we've already seen. And that really, really scares me. And it's disgraceful that the Democrats are going along with this and pretending like, oh yeah, we'll give you whatever you want.
So as Martin said, migration was one of the main topics that Trump touched upon during his speech. This is what he had to say about the situation in Central America, which drew a large rejection from several senators.
As we speak, large organized caravans are on the march to the United States. We have just heard that Mexican cities, in order to remove the illegal immigrants from their communities, are getting trucks and buses to bring them up to our country in areas where there is little border protection.
Despite attacks by the Trump administration, migrants from Central America are still escaping violence and poverty in their nations. Our correspondent in Mexico, Pablo Pérez, has more.
Central American migrants continue to arrive to the border between Mexico and the United States. They have mostly stopped going to Tijuana, but are choosing other cities such as Piedras Negras and Acuña, two places where there are no fences and the border can be crossed through the Rio Grande River. Over 2,000 Central American migrants have arrived in these cities. Many of them are temporarily staying in shelters. Some of them have also begun their asylum requests to enter the U.S., while others are considering getting jobs in Mexico. A number of people from the migrant caravans decided to move away from the main routes, going to the industrial city of Monterrey in Nuevo León, where relatives and friends were waiting for them. The United States have sent almost 4,000 more troops to the border, looking to stop migrants from crossing into the country. During his State of the Union address, U.S. President Donald Trump pointed again to migration as a source of problems for the U.S., painting the southern border as a place in crisis.
That was Paulo Perez from Mexico City. Now to Colombia. International organizations are calling on President Iván Duque to do something to stop the continued murders of social leaders. Let's learn more of what's going on in Colombia.
In the face of the wave of assassinations of social leaders, human rights organizations and experts have conducted a study to determine the patterns of crimes against the Afro-descent, peasant, and indigenous populations.
The phenomenon of the killings of social leaders is rising at the hands of local criminal gangs. They have links with armed groups on a national level and are outsourced so they can commit those murders and authorities register them as common crimes without examining that they have a direct connection with illegal armed groups.
The study, called Killing of Social Leaders on the Post Agreement, also reveals the apparent participation of the Colombian state.
Prosecutors have put ELN first, but we don't see them as the biggest aggressors. In the report, we registered 8 cases of assassinations at the hands of the ELN and 2 by the EPL, while 11 leaders were killed by the members of the army, and according to reports, 3 leaders were killed by the police.
Since the agreement, there have been multiple armed actors that have occupied territories where social investment and peace agreements have never arrived.
The state has failed to occupy the territories left by those organizations that are reintegrated, and some of them are half-integrated, because there is a recycling of paramilitary groups from 2005 and 2007, and there is also dissent.
In Colombia, there's a new political landscape linked to the next election of mayors and governors. That's why experts predict that the murders of political, social, and environmental leaders will rise dramatically. The task of President Iván Duque will be to implement the measures that the United Nations, social movements, and the Ombudsman have recommended.
In other news, Guyana says ExxonMobil has made 2 additional discoveries of oil off the country's shore. Authorities say this brings the total number of discoveries on the Stabroek block to 12. Guyana intends to begin commercial exploration next year. Police have rescued 19 South American girls from a human trafficking ring in Trinidad. Officers arrested 6 people for harboring the girls ages 15 to 19 from several countries in the region. The minors were medically examined and are under police watch.
Actually, there have been 19 young ladies, all under the age of 21, most of them 15 and 16 years old, that were actually held against their will. They were basically slaves. They were released, rescued by the Special Operation Response Team last night. As I said, 19 of them, most of them 15 and 16 years old, being used as prostitutes by certain individuals.
February 6 marks the birth of Cuban revolutionary and commander Camilo Cienfuegos. Born in Havana in 1932, Cienfuegos was part of the Gran Malanding, a key event in the revolution. He defeated Batista's dictatorship forces in Yaguajay, and after the triumph of the revolution, he became the head of the Revolutionary Armed Forces. We're taking one last break, but stay with us. Welcome back. The U.S. House of Representatives has held its first hearing on gun violence in nearly 8 years. It comes a week ahead of the anniversary of the Florida school shooting, in which a gunman killed 17 people at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. President Donald Trump has been criticized for not mentioning gun violence in his State of the Union address.
Children do not fear being shot. Congress has done almost nothing in recent years to address gun violence. Citizens across the country have been organizing and demanding action. As a result, several states have strengthened their gun laws. I'm disappointed that in his lengthy State of the Union address last night, President Trump did not see fit even to mention the need to protect our citizens against gun violence. But it is evident from the energy in the crowd in this room, as well as the millions of people across the country fighting for sensible gun safety laws, that the public is demanding national legislation too.
The President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, has slammed those who called for a Brexit without any idea of how to execute it.
I've been wondering what that special place in hell looks like for those who promoted Brexit without even a sketch of a plan how to carry it safely.
And Tusk's statement comes a day before UK Prime Minister Theresa May is due in Brussels to renegotiate the withdrawal deal. However, Tusk says the European Union will not make a new offer on Brexit. That means the UK could leave the European Union on March 29 with no deal, unless May can convince the EU. The National Assembly in France has passed what's been called an anti-hooligan bill, which many say will infringe on civil liberties. The bill will make it illegal for protesters to conceal their faces. Law enforcement will also be better able to use facial recognition technology to track down and prosecute demonstrators. This follows months of yellow vest protests. This bill will go to a Senate vote on March 12th.
This law is bad news for protests. I tried, and I'm not the only one, to stress that this is a delicate issue, a very important and subtle one. By definition, the right to demonstrate frequently affects people who are not satisfied with something. The current government is talking about deviating from standard legislative norms. Such an important decision on prohibiting freedom to demonstrate, which can sometimes be completely justified, should be taken by independent judges and not bodies which are dependent on political powers. There is a risk that the government, which I no longer trust, will restrict this right.
Now let's take a look at more stories from around the world.
The lives of conjoined twins born in Yemen is at risk if they don't receive medical treatment abroad. Doctors have warned that the 2-week-old twins will die if they remain in the country, as its health system cannot keep them alive. However, the ongoing war has forced the closure of the capital's airport, so the boys are unable to leave. Doctors are appealing to the United Nations and humanitarian organizations to help arrange the transfer of the twins.
They need to travel immediately. They will not be able to survive in Yemen under the social, political, and economic circumstances in this country.
Thousands of teachers rallied in Al-Kasbah Square in Tunisia, near the Prime Minister's office, to demand better working conditions and higher salaries. Teachers' protests have been ongoing for 2 months, and exams have reportedly been boycotted, affecting thousands of students. It's something that's led parents to condemn the conflict between the government and the education sector. Previously, teacher demands for more money and a reduction in the retirement age were rejected due to the budgetary situation.
Firstly, this is the 6th demonstration which the secondary teachers are holding. Today we march towards the ministry, carrying banners and placards, asking that our demands are met. Then we went to the Al-Kasbah Square. Our main demands are educational reforms and early retirement for teachers.
A market in London that serves as a hub for the Latin American community is set to be torn down and replaced with luxury flats. The market will be bought by a private developer and demolished, despite opposition from traders and residents. Even United Nations human rights experts have warned of the effects that destroying the market would have on cultural life in the area.
And before we end, we are remembering Bob Marley Day. This date marks the birth of the late legendary Jamaican reggae artist. Marley's songs of revolution appeal to people of all cultures. He used reggae to expose and fight for the causes of the economically and politically oppressed. The reggae icon would have been 74 years old today.
All pirates, yes, they rabbi, sold died to the merchant ships. Minutes after they took I.
And with that, we come to the end of this news brief, but you can find these and more stories from our website at telesurenglish.net. And we're also on social media, so go ahead and follow us. For Telesur English, I'm Carla Gonzalez. Thank you for watching.